This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. Welcome to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. I am Dave Thompson, your host, and today I'm honored to have with me a good friend north of the border, Bruce Pitt-Payne. Thanks for joining me, Bruce.
You're very welcome, Dave. Good to talk to you again.
Sure. Bruce has a ton of experience that we're going to dive into, but I'm going to give a high-level background, and then I'll let you kind of expand on that. But I know a majority of Bruce's career before, I'm going to say retired, but I'll put it in air quotes because he's still working like a madman.
Yeah, I'm not retired.
No. But before we get into kind of what you're currently working on, I know you spent over 2 decades with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as a major crime investigator, interview specialist, advisor. I know you did a lot of work on instrumental in getting the phased interview model and the peace model incorporated into the RCMP and kind of across Canada. Bruce has been, not just for me and for our training firm, but for others across the country and internationally, a subject matter expert on investigative interviewing, whether it's with subjects, witnesses, victims, even interviews with children and trauma-informed interviewing. So I'm honored to have Bruce here today, and we're going to dive into a whole bunch of topics, ranging from the evolution of interviewing in your career, some of the differences across borders.
Yeah, it's changed a little bit since I started.
Yeah. Well, let's start with that. So was your first exposure to interviewing with RCMP, or what did that all begin for you?
Yeah, it actually was. I joined the RCMP late in 1991, got sent to our training academy called Depot Division in Regina, Saskatchewan. And I did my 6 months boot camp training, and the only interview training that we had really was at some point we had to pair up with a troop mate, and one of the two was given a script, a very short script to read, so that when we said, "Tell us what happened," they read it out to us and we wrote it down.
Okay.
And that was the interview. And we were told to come up with a bunch of questions beforehand. You were scored on that, on the questions beforehand. So it's completely different to what we do now.
Yeah.
In fact, we revamped our training in 2012. It was one of the moments I was most proud of, was when our interview team from British Columbia went back in 2012 to Depot and set up recording rooms, interview rooms in trailers. So they would have 32 of them set up for audio and video, and we actually trained all of the instructors. So even if they hadn't ever done an interview in their career, they were further ahead than they were before. And initially, word had it they were very good. I got them then coming through to my courses in Chilliwack once they were in the field, and I noticed a distinct difference in what was being pumped out. I don't know if that's the same right now, but for a while it worked really well.
Yeah, it's crazy. If you think about, you wish interviews were that easy, that you just had a script, they had a script, and then you could just go in and get what you already knew you were going to get. But that's not reality.
Well, no, all we learned was how to actually be a stenographer and take notes from somebody. We didn't actually learn very much at all, which is tough because I think you and I both know that most investigations are foiled not by poor suspect interviews, it's by poor witness interviews.
Yeah, and that's something I want to dive into as well. I think people forget that you're, especially in a major crime, you're probably interviewing 100 times more witness interviews than you are a suspect interview. And we don't focus on the training there. So I want to dig into that real quick just for our listeners, because when they hear RCMP or Royal Canadian Mounted Police, how could you explain how that correlates to what they would see in the U.S.? What is that agency?
Wow. I don't know that you have anything like that in the U.S. And here's why is people often refer to the RCMP as the FBI North, meaning that they are the federal police force. But the FBI doesn't do many of the things, and this isn't a put down, it's just I'll show you the broad range that the RCMP covers. Yes, they do federal and serious crimes. They do things like that. They do international intelligence work. The problem is that they shouldn't say problem, but the part that spreads them thin is they also contract out to the provinces, so your equivalent of states, and to cities to do uniform police work.
Okay.
So they would say, like, my town, Maple Ridge in British Columbia, has a contract and has about 100 RCMP officers doing what any police department would do. It's your local police department, but the city and the province have to pay the federal government to have us do that contract.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
that's something the FBI doesn't actually do. But many of the bigger cities across Canada aren't actually policed by the RCMP, and as far as the uniform patrol is concerned, it's actually their own municipal or provincial police.
So then, when you were talking about your first exposure to interviewing, which was more a note taking class, it seems
Yes.
like, but and again, I don't know current day what it might look like, but I can speak to a little bit of going through a police academy and
Yeah.
talking to some of our kind of followers that have gone through investigations training, and the amount of time spent on interviewing in an academy. Well, I'll let you kind of expand. But what did that feel like compared to the amount of time spent on defensive tactics and firearms and driving a vehicle and all those other things?
Well, and with the RCMP, you had drill as well. I mean, you see behind, we have a history. We are a paramilitary unit, and I'm using the we now, even though I'm
Sure.
not with them. But it was designed as a paramilitary unit, so a lot of those trappings are still around. And if you look, it's very British Army, the colors and such. So the dress and deportment, there was a lot of time on that.
Right.
There was just to wear that red serge and know how to wear it properly. So as they said, we didn't have our hat back and look like it was a bonnet. And,
Right.
and that sort of feedback, it was immense. Learning how to march as a troop, there were many hours of that. But as we got out, many of us then started saying, although that may have been nice, we went out as investigators that maybe were a little lacking in certain areas, such as the interviewing. And I never got an interview course. I joined in 91, and 98 was my first interview course.
Right.
So in the field, that was pretty much sort of old school, I will call it. Interview and interrogation techniques where there was an accusation and you stopped the denials. And most of the course was on the suspect interviewing, again, not on the witness interviewing, which was absolutely inane.
Yeah, I think so. As you start to bring up kind of old school traditional interrogation techniques, which I know are still used in a variety of agencies across both countries here. Um, but if you look back, and we'll kind of dive through this, at the time that you were using techniques like that, were thought like this works, this is effective,
Oh,
this is what
yeah.
everybody else is doing. What are there some just top level things we can dive into them that you wish you knew then that you've learned now about interviewing that would have made maybe more successful conversations for you then?
Well, I think you just used the term right there, conversation. I wish I had known it was a conversation. That conversation is two-sided. It's back and forth, and that's what we have become. And that is what we should always aspire to. And it wasn't a conversation. My goal in the past was, and I know now there's all different sorts of terms to minimize what our goals are. We
Yeah.
used to say it was to get the truth, but it was to get a confession. There's no two ways about it. It was to get somebody to either confess or clear themselves. So we thought that those are the two options. We presented it. It's balanced. It's fair. But it was very much us going in with our bias, telling somebody what we believed, and then trying to get them, extracting is the term. It's
Mm.
pulling it out of them in a nice way, in a nice, soft, persuasive way, getting them to tell us what we hope to hear in the first place. So that's the biggest change is it's now a conversation as opposed to a one-sided, here's what I want from you.
Before I want to add to that is the in Canada is it normal or legislated that interviews are being recorded, video recorded, or what does the standard look like right now?
No, our courts are very hesitant to ever say you will do the following.
Okay.
They have, but very rarely. It's a very nuanced approach. So what they would say is, um, And it was a ruling, Regina versus Oikel, from around 2000. I can't believe it. It's 23 years old right now. And that case came out following a few inquiries into wrongful convictions where they said, you got to start recording. So it started with audio recording, then video recording. And our Supreme Court has said the following. They haven't said, if it isn't audio and video recorded for a suspect interview, it must be ruled inadmissible. What they said was it depends. If
Okay.
the judge is unable to decide whether the statement was given voluntarily beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the Crown prosecutor's burden, then it will fall and there will be no remedy to fix it. So it's a very high burden that is put on. So what we taught right after that case was, folks, they're not telling you, but they are really suggesting to the judges, if it's not video recorded, don't even bother with it.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I and our organizations are huge proponents of recording.
Yeah.
And I think in the States, it might be off by one or two now, but I know we were at least 31 states that had mandates on recording suspect interrogations,
Yes.
which we can dive into. But the reason I wanted to bring that up based off what you just said is this transition from kind of confession seeking
Yes.
to information gathering or
Yeah.
intelligence gathering. I think, and I'm curious what your perspective is on this, but from an investigator's perspective, recording helps, right? Because I'm not going in the room just walking out with, I need an I did it. I can walk out with an hour, 2 hours, whatever, worth of details to further investigate.
Oh yeah. Bang on. Bang on. And let's face it, if you didn't have it recorded and you were aiming for certain detail, it would have to be more structured and it would take away from the conversational approach. So it actually frees us off to be ourselves, to be genuine, to be sincere, and to ask people to come to us. We're inviting them. And that can only happen by building rapport and by showing empathy. And once again, conversation, it's two-way. Even the term rapport has been grossly misrepresented in the past because it's been, I'm going to go in and I'm going to give that person a rapport. No, it's what we're doing here today, Dave. I totally agree, is that is rapport. It's that back and forth. You leave a
Yeah.
little bit, you take a little bit, and you can't do that without the recording. And if our goal is to get information, and I like your term intelligence, then that will only happen if we can do that sort of approach. And that's the
Yeah.
recording.
Yeah, and you mentioned something at the beginning of that I know is known as cognitive load theory, right? It's
Yeah.
if we're so focused, and this goes to anybody that's listening, even if you're not doing interviews, but you're going to a business meeting or whatever it might be. If you're thinking, okay, I got to ask this question, say this, what did they look like when they said that? What they sneezed? Do I care about that? And then you got to try to recap it in your notes without recording. I mean,
Yeah.
what's your experience like, I guess, trying to write a report or a narrative after an interview that wasn't recorded, your recollection of what happened?
Well, it's to the point it's so bad and it's so anxiety provoking because I want to truly represent what happened in that room, or it's all for naught, isn't it? There's so much nuance going on there, and it's so hard to reproduce that afterwards. Um, I'm going to give you an example of where it might be more my bias on how I pick up on it. Is we had some commercials up here where the husband went out and fixed the deck, and then the wife would say, "Wow, you did that to the deck," and then versus, "Wow, you did that to the deck." There's a huge difference in how it actually comes out, and we could miss that if we are just trying to transcribe. So
Yeah, that's a perfect example. And one of the other benefits I feel like of recording, as you talked about confession seeking versus intelligence gathering, is now if I'm structuring the approach to an interview, which I want to dive into some of the different approaches that you've learned throughout your career now that you teach, I might design an interview method that's strictly focused on how do I get somebody to give me an alibi, commit to something that now I can go measure against evidence. And when I have a
yes.
recording, it's so much easier.
Well, for many reasons, and it's not just with suspects and respondents, but I'm sure that, Dave, have you ever had somebody or heard of somebody that was a witness that went, I want to lay a complaint, workplace incidences. I want to lay a complaint or have somebody investigate an allegation of bullying or sexual harassment. and it meant something to the person at the time. They were really motivated, so they gave a statement with all the detail. And then as it came closer to a hearing time when the respondent has decided to challenge it, it's now become very real. It causes a lot of stress on the survivor, and they say, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore.
Right.
So they might actually say something like, we find this in intimate partner violence, and it's totally understandable if we're educated that a partner would say, you know what, I just want to end this and not continue with the repetitive trauma it's causing me to go through the process. So when they take the stand, for instance, they might say, you know what, I don't really remember. Or, you know what, I think I sort of maybe misunderstood that. I was drinking. And they will try to minimize it so that their life can go on and they can keep some control. Totally understandable, but it sure doesn't help your case, does it?
Right.
So even with a witness, you can go back and possibly challenge that witness a little bit or use that recording under very certain legal circumstances in Canada, for instance, as their statement if it's adopted by the court. And
Right.
same with the suspect. A suspect, I don't even bother interviewing respondents or suspects if it's not recorded, because they can say whatever they want and change it later on and say, well, you got it wrong, Bruce.
Right. Yeah. And what you just said, it protects all aspects of the court, the working group here, because, in the States, I know you have the Charter of Rights, we've got Miranda,
Yep.
and, there's so many arguments whether Miranda was advised properly or not, or in the private
Yeah.
sector, whether the employee was allowed to leave or not. And when it's all
Mm-hmm.
recorded, there's no question if it was done. Now it's a question, was it done thoroughly and properly, and do they understand it? But at
Yeah.
least the advisement of those things are transparent.
Well, you're bang on, and I like to say the recording is my notes, and then I don't have to. I'll still take some
Right.
notes during the interview, but I don't have to document every CYA that possibly could come up. It is there. And the other thing is, frankly, if I make a mistake, everybody should know about it.
Right.
And that's the thing. Now, our Supreme Court in that Oikel decision, Dave, it was awesome because when it talked to recording, and it recommended the judges should really assess whether they're going to allow it to be a voluntary interview and admit it if it's not recorded, and video recorded as well for the suspect. They gave reasons why it should be recorded, and it had all of the things we've spoken about. But the last one, and the one I preach to, is the judges, the triers of fact, the prosecutors, all the lawyers get to see what a darn good job you did,
Right.
because they
Right. I
don't
mean, if you
see anything other than TV interrogations and
sorry,
such.
yeah,
Or all of a sudden you get Brendan Dassey or Dacey, however it's pronounced.
right,
They see that on the media on YouTube and think everybody's doing those poor interviews.
right, yeah. Brendan Dassey's case, just, and I'm curious about kind of the evolution of interviewing in your space, but
Mhm.
that one's near and dear to my heart. I've been very supportive of Brendan, and what's interesting is if that wasn't recorded, we might not even be talking about it. There wouldn't have been,
Exactly.
and so it's the only thing that helped to figure
Exactly.
that
Bang
out.
on,
So
Dave.
yeah,
Bang on.
so as we look now kind of through this evolution, which when we say evolution of interviewing standards, it's not like it's a flip a switch on and off and agencies go from one to the other, or countries for that matter. We still have some in wrong spaces here that would need some edging along, but there's a method up in Canada, before we get into kind of peace and cognitive and
Hmm.
explain what that is. But there's this method that I believe was originated in Canada. You can help explain that further, but
Hmm.
known as Mr. Big technique, that a lot of people don't
Yes.
really know what that is. So maybe you can just
Yeah.
give a high
It
level.
sounds like something from Boris and Natasha, doesn't it,
Right.
Mr. Big?
Right.
Remember Rocky and Bullwinkle?
Right. Yes.
Um, the Mr. Big scenario or technique is we have to sort of differentiate it from a normal investigative interview. Is it is not the police or anybody else interviewing a suspect, where that person being interviewed knows who's interviewing them. It's an undercover technique, which means that in Canada, as long as the person that is being investigated, the subject of this undercover operation, as long as he or she doesn't believe that the person they're dealing with is a cop, then it also doesn't fall under the rules for giving rights to counsel and saying whether you're detained or not, and all of those protections that all Canadians have. So it is undercover. It is controversial in the sense that there have been false confessions given to the undercover operators in the past. And we actually had one, I believe it was a wrongful conviction. It was deemed to go that far. And eventually some restraint was put on the technique and those that used it by the Supreme Court of Canada, because there were no rules beforehand. It hadn't been adjudged in that way, adjudicated.
So this is, as I've described it to people, and they think, how is this different? Most people think undercover technique is you've got a narcotics detective, or whoever it might be, is kind of infiltrating an already existing criminal
Yeah.
enterprise, and they're trying to fit in. This is almost the opposite of that, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's a highly successful and always has been technique. What happens is, and I'm not saying anything that has not been in the media, that it is not a what we call a hidden covert technique once it's done, is it all has to be played out in the court. So every time this is used, it's explained as I will in the media. So for anybody thinking, hey, this guy's really bad, Bruce is giving out state secrets,
Right.
it is not. It's an open court process. So what happens is they have to make a meet eventually. The police in an undercover capacity will make a meet with the subject. First off, there must be, you can't just say on a whim, we're going to, or speculation, we think this person is involved. You have to have some suspicion, some grounds, maybe not enough to arrest, but at least to start what will not be an abusive process or a miscarriage of justice.
Okay.
So they make the meet, and then eventually, after becoming friends with the initial undercover operators, they are taken to who they call Mr. Big, and there will be basically a job interview. Do you want to join this criminal organization? If so, you must spill your guts on the following, because we don't want the heat coming to us, that sort of thing. But along the way, to make it real, there are scenarios where, for instance, they may get paid, the subject may get paid money to work for this group. So they wean this person into the gang, starting at the bottom, and they make it very, very believable. Unfortunately, some of those scenarios bring with it, if the person, for instance, is destitute, then they might say, I did whatever I'm accused of during the job interview because they like the money flow and they want it to
Sure.
come in. But also, so it could affect the reliability is what I'm getting at. And on top of that, some of the scenarios might make it, some people think that if they don't play ball right up to the end, they're going to get hurt by this organized criminal organization. So there may be some reasons that could take away from the reliability, and the courts have been very strong on that now.
Yeah. So when you think, and I'm glad you brought up those points, because I want to kind of relate those. This reliability issue
Yeah.
is the same thing that we see in a variety of techniques. And it's when, and I'm curious how you feel like if Mr. Big, maybe if it's used inappropriately or outside the guidelines, how it relates. But reliability can be affected by like fact feeding, right? Giving up details
Oh, yeah.
of what happened. And then coerciveness. And that's where this is interesting. And you kicked it off with, because they're not technically in custody by this perspective, they may not be advised of certain rights. So
Yeah.
now we got the legal thought there, but then the psychological impact as well. If this person had representation, they would have known not to do this or that. But what about from a reliability standpoint with compliance? You talked about maybe destitute of financially. What about even like the need to fit in, or the need to look cool or gain credibility as a criminal? Is that something that comes across?
It will be looked at now. And it's not just vulnerable, meaning, say, and I'll give an example, you're on the autism spectrum, you have fetal alcohol syndrome. It's not like that, or that you have an intellectual deficit somewhere. That's not necessarily what they mean by vulnerable, but are you vulnerable to the scenarios, meaning you will act different than if you weren't destitute. So some people might be drawn into it further, and
Right.
it decreases the reliability because they're doing it for not non-informed reasons, if that's a
Yeah.
way to look at it.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it that way because as investigators, we're not experts on all the vulnerabilities or
No, we're
suggestibilities.
not.
And I did a recording of an episode with a developmental psychologist, and we talked about some of these risk factors. And so you have some of the things you mentioned that might be obvious, right? Maybe somebody has cognitive disability,
Yeah.
age, but then you have things like, are they just tired? Are they hungry? Is there situational factors that there's a friend that might implicate them, and there's retaliation? There's so many different things that make people
Oh, bang
vulnerable.
on. See,
Yeah.
and Dave, sorry to jump in here, but I
No.
mean, right away, I'm thinking when I go to teach now, in the past, I could get away with a lot more as far as dirty jokes and different things like that. And you could really push the envelope in the past. Like I'm talking 15, 20 years ago. But I think we all know that the expectations of a teacher has changed. You drop an F bomb, somebody will probably complain, whereas the rest of the class might like it, the majority, but it doesn't matter. So, what I have always said about interviewing is the same as teaching. Rule number one is know your audience. And
Yeah.
rule number two is you will never always know your audience.
Yeah.
So that's the way I look at interviewing too, is I could come in and I could have a very high functioning autistic person sitting in front of me and I wouldn't even pick up on it because they could probably outdo me in vocabulary and such. And who am I to pick up on that nuance that might be what we need? So I there's a guy, I'm going to sell his wares here. Matt Logan he had his PhD. He was a police officer as well, and he was our operational psychologist. I would actually bring him in to a lot of interviews because he would sit there and watch and say, I don't think you're going overboard, or maybe back off. Or it was beautiful when somebody said, oh, I'm on Ativan, and we all went, oh no, they're on drugs. And he would be able to say, well, that would actually make him normal if
Ah,
he's on it, if he's
right.
not on it, or methadone or any of those things. So they helped us out. Why wouldn't we use these experts? Because
Right.
I just don't have the skill.
Yeah, that's good. That's good feedback. Yeah, and you might not have the time either as the investigator in a field interview or something to be able to diagnose that. But
You're
having
right.
people you can rely on is
Yeah.
helpful. So as Canada and other nations move forward in different type of interviewing techniques. So we mentioned the phased interview model, the piece
Yes.
model. We got the cognitive interview, the strategic use of evidence, trauma informed interviewing. There's all these different concepts. And what I'm curious about from a communication standpoint, right, to kind of go with the theme of what we're talking about, is you've had a lot of experience of teaching and incorporating change. And that can be difficult with people who've always done something the same way forever. So we can just, I guess,
Yeah.
start there and then get into some of the weeds. But what's that experience been like, or what have you learned in that process?
It's very frustrating, and it's harder than the actual interview to constantly
Mm.
feel like you have to explain yourself to people when you're looking and going, it's common knowledge. And like
Right.
that's what it feels like. So you're always climbing uphill, having to say, "Oh, okay." They say, "Well, you cite your research on that." And you're going, "Well, there's about 3 billion research projects to do with a certain thing. Which one would you like?" And you go, "Oh, well, I haven't seen it, so I don't have to accept it." Or there's nothing wrong with anecdote. What worked for my buddy or for me for 30 years should still be used. That's the frustrating part, is people don't necessarily want to follow the science, or they follow it when they want to.
Right.
Um, so that's the frustrating part. But the other part is the mythology out there, and I've had the opportunity to come down and consult and do some teaching in the U.S., for instance. And it's really interesting that when you first say, "Well, here's what we have to offer," and they say, and this isn't everybody. I think that the change is afoot already. I think people are becoming receptive, but you will still get people saying, we don't need somebody from another country coming here to teach us how to interview. And I go, no, that's fine. I'm not here. It's not the Canadians and the British once again coming to burn the White House.
Right.
We are trying to do that. But if you want our help, we will help you out. And they say, no, we know what we're doing. There's no need for this. Why would we need your peace interview or cognitive interview? And then I go, would this help? I'm not actually coming here with anything new. You guys invented it.
Right.
So that's a shock to many people is when I explained that the cognitive interview came from Florida. And when the United Kingdom had its miscarriages of justice, they brought people over, the people who invented the cognitive interview and other international experts, and said, here's our peace model. And then it came back to Canada and now down to the US. So it's actually no different than the blues. And I've seen before you have guitars and different things in the
Right.
background sometimes. So I think you have an appreciation for the music analogy here. The blues is distinctly American. The blues went to England and then it came back as the Rolling Stones or Led Zeppelin, but it's
Right.
still the blues. So that's the way I like to explain to maybe get rid of some of that blockage that we see in
That's a
North
good
America.
concept. Well, and that's how research is built, right? Is and you and I, as two practitioners talking about research, I'm sure somebody with PhDs laughing at us, but we've
Yeah.
we've embedded ourselves in that world, and I have learned research builds off itself the same way. Somebody has this concept like the cognitive, which has now grown to more of a trauma informed cognitive, because it's
Yes.
always how do we close any loopholes or research it further and adapt to cultures. And but to make you feel any better, it's not just Canadian coming across teaching the U.S. has that problem. We sometimes it's even going from one state to another, or from teaching a federal agency to then the city police, and it's this concept. And even people are listening that have zero engagement or responsibility in the law enforcement space. When we talk about rapport, that rapport is important with your partner, with your spouse, with
Yes.
your boss, with the coach of your kid's baseball team, right? If you're trying to negotiate
Absolutely.
something or make a compromise.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Dave, I mean, it's rapport, it's the transfer of control, it's making it all about the other person. Um, in a sense, and you listed off all these interview techniques and names and such. You've got the phased, you've got the cognitive, the strategic use, you've got the W, as I was saying earlier, Z,
Yeah, right.
which I think you say Z. We've got all of these. And at some point, um, we're going to find if we're intelligent, but we haven't found the wisdom yet, I think, to say an interview should just be an interview. It When I'm teaching now, um, we shouldn't have to say, well, this interview is only for this. So I'm teaching your
Mm,
group, it's just going to be like this. An interview is just a form of communication between two people. That's all it is. It's a conversation. So when you get motivational interviewing, people saying, well, do you teach motivational interviewing? Absolutely. Do you teach trauma informed? Absolutely. It's the same thing.
right.
It's all together. If you follow the science and use it instead of a linear approach where you go, here's the first step, here's the second step, here's the third step, and say it is used depending upon what you are given by the respondent, by the person in front of you, the interviewee. You are going to be response oriented. It's a framework. You will pick and say, maybe I'll do this now. This person here seems to have gone through a traumatic experience. I will reach into the basket and maybe use a little bit of this. You build it to the person you're dealing with. It's just communication.
Yeah, that brings us back kind of to the first example you shared of walking in and having a script, right? Of
Yes,
practicing. And I think in today's space, which is what you were just saying, is being adaptable in the conversation, but knowing that science does play a strong part into
yes,
practice. And I give this example when we're trying to get people to change their concept. If interviewing to me is a professional skill and it's something you need to stay continued education focus on. But if you were to go have surgery and went to your doctor, and in Canada it would be free because of your health care, but we won't get into that.
not much.
Yeah. But you go to your doctor and want to have a surgery, and he or she says, well, I graduated medical school 30 years ago, I know everything I need to know, I don't read papers anymore, I haven't gone to a seminar since, I'm good. That's terrifying. You'd leave. And I
Yeah.
think people need to realize that communication, no matter how you use it, is just as powerful. And there's so many changes all the time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm thinking right away of some old doctor coming out with leeches, and you're
Right.
going, what? Okay. You're absolutely right. It should be continuous learning. And I have an advantage now. I went from the police world to the non-police world, teaching and doing as a practitioner. And I've got to say that the non-police world is far more proactive and follows the train of thought that you just said there. Whereas the police world tends to be very insular and protective. They will only have their people teaching their people. So you get what I call intellectual incest happening,
Okay.
where it's just the same stuff over and over again, less challenging of the status quo. And that's extremely dangerous. But you could also get people that, again, don't learn anything their whole career. And they could even leave and go into the private sector and say, oh, I was a cop, so everybody assumes you're well trained in everything too, which you're not.
Yeah, it's terrifying. Yeah, we've got a slide in one of our training decks that says if it ain't broke, break it. And it's
Yeah, I
kind of,
love it. I
you got
love
to
it.
break that cycle. I want to ask you as we're kind of wrapping up, but we mentioned phased interview model and piece,
Yeah.
and we don't have to go into all the details of everything, but just for listeners, what generally speaking, what is that? And we'll
Well,
probably have a whole episode dedicated to it, but just what is
yeah,
that
just
concept?
in a nutshell, the PEACE model is a great acronym that stands for planning and preparation, engage and explain. You've got your account, clarify, and challenge. So that's where you get the meat and potatoes, the
Right.
information. Then you close the interview. Then you evaluate everything that happened and what you should be doing afterwards. Um, it's an acronym for a proper framework, which can move on. Now we can move on to the phased interview model, which is the RCMP's model, which means it's not linear. You should be bouncing in and out of concepts and principles and what the science has told us works best to achieve your goal of getting information that's complete and reliable. So, of interest, though, I do want to mention, Dave, is
Yeah.
there's a misconception that there's a phased interview, just one type. There are two. There's the RCMP phased interview for witnesses, so for the people that are not facing any consequence, lawful consequence. That's really just the cognitive interview. I was
Okay.
in charge of building that myself, and it is the cognitive interview for all intents and purposes. Then there's the phased interview for suspects, which is specific to suspects with legal obligations and to do with, for instance, here's some of the things that were cut out. No more of this voodoo detection of deception by
Right.
physiological changes. All of that was taken out of there. The behavioral analysis interviews, behavioral observation questions, all junked out of there. So it's more scientifically supported. But I must say it does have at the end, one of the concessions pretty much to get this instated was to keep an accusatory phase. And that's mainly because that's what polygraph people that
Right.
really lead the interview world for police departments. They really wanted that in there still, but it's not done the same as the old style. It's very soft shoe. It's not they don't stop the denials, for instance. It's an amalgamation of all of them that are problematic. So it's not putting your hand up and saying, no, we know you did it. It might be, I'm a little confused here because the evidence is showing. See how there's a bit of a difference? And you're
Right.
still trying to get them to talk and commit themselves to something.
That last piece, it is one of the most simplest things, but like you said something earlier, how we're intelligent enough to do something, we're
Yeah.
not doing it or combining these, and it's
We're intelligent, but not wise.
wise, right? And you think
Yeah.
about if my whole goal of a conversation is to get information from somebody, as
Yeah.
soon as I hear information I don't like, I stop them from talking. That is the
Yeah.
complete opposite. But what you just transitioned to, which is a lot of this same concept. And again, if anybody is thinking, how do I apply this in my life? It's
Mhm.
anybody that disagrees with you or is about to say, no, I didn't do it, or no, I don't like that. Instead of just shutting it down, ask the question,
Yeah.
why, or tell me more about this, or how
There
does
we
that
go.
conflict?
Like I'm going to give you a very distinct, blatant example of the mindset change. And really, it's a cultural change. That's all anybody's asking for. So in the old days, if somebody said I didn't do it, we would go, oh, now I have to interrogate. Uh-oh, now I
Right.
have to impose my own thoughts and feelings. I better have some good themes. I better be able to talk and monologue for 3 days. And now when somebody says I didn't do it, internally I'm doing a happy dance because they're not saying I'm not talking to you. Now, notice I'm not hoping for a confession, but I want that person to talk to me. Yes,
Right.
I do want that. And I will use persuasion. I'm not going to lie. We all use persuasion, but it's persuasion to get conversation and dialogue going, not a confession. It's a big
Right.
difference.
Right.
So I would say still, hey, Dave, you said you didn't do it. That's exactly why I'm here today, because if I wasn't here, nobody'd be able to explain that to anybody or ask you if you didn't do it, what were you doing that day? I haven't made up my mind on this.
Mm.
I'm not one-sided. It's my job to show that you didn't do this. So tell me what you were doing that day. So I do a happy dance and say, if you said I didn't do it, that's still an agenda, and you're
Right.
willing to talk about it because you brought it up.
Right.
Right?
And
There's a difference.
there's, yeah, that's great. And there's a chance that maybe they didn't do it. So let's listen to that.
Exactly.
And then also as they're giving you, and maybe they always stay with no, I didn't do it, but they start
Yep.
to provide to you an alibi or names of people they were with or something that now you can go corroborate or disprove. And that could be
Yeah.
just as satisfactory. So that's important.
Yeah, and the other thing is that when I teach now, and any teacher should still be honest with everybody, and I know you guys are, where, I mean, do you tell them, listen, this isn't a panacea. You're not going to get everybody to talk to you.
Right.
There's probably going to be 30% that will still probably say, I'm not talking to you. Why? Because they got possibly good legal advice. They're scared of you. They know there's a real inevitable consequence to talking to you. So 30% might say, I'm not going to talk, and they never will. Another 30% might have come into that interview going, I'm going to judge Dave. I'm going to
Right.
see what he's up to, and I might talk. And then another 40%, if I've got the math right, this is probably why I was an arts major,
Yeah.
the
Use the
other
metric system.
40% is coming in to say, yes, I'm going to talk because I'm innocent or I want to explain an agenda and fool Dave or whatever. But that's how it works. We can't be unrealistic either.
Yeah.
I
I
mean,
think
that's
that's,
their right not to talk, isn't it?
yeah, exactly. And that's important. And not to have tunnel vision, right? Is to
Yeah.
think, well, this is the conclusion of my investigation. Once I get the I did it, I'm good. Instead, this is
Yeah,
an equal part to the investigation. Let it kind of steer you where it may. So I think
exactly.
that's good. I want to kind of close off with giving you a chance to kind of give us one more take. I know there's a lot of stuff we talked about today, and I appreciate your time. But for those listening and maybe reflection, either whether it's on your career, what you're teaching now, but any kind of last takeaway or final truth for people just on general communication or interview strategies going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the strongest message I always have is follow the science. Um, yes, there is always room for anecdotal evidence, but remember that is very limited. You might see those things happen, but it doesn't mean that it is a best practice. It's no different than I could put a blindfold on, walk across the busiest highway in Canada and not get hit, but it's just a fluke. Okay, it just might happen that once. But if I do it 30 times, I might get flattened by a semi. So it doesn't make it a best practice just because you've seen it work in your favor a few times. And then the other take is just remember we are all creatures of our experience, of our own environment, of our past, and we might not see the world the same as somebody else who had a different background. We are biased. We are all prejudiced. Uh, just be aware of that and try not to allow that into the interview process. But don't try and pretend that we are beyond bias. We are all that way.
Yeah, I like that. That's a great take. Both of those really important. Important take. Simple, but difficult sometimes
Yeah.
for people to incorporate. I like that. Well, thanks, Bruce. I know I'll volunteer you that if anybody's interested in learning more, connecting with Bruce, he's very active on LinkedIn. I know you publish a ton of articles. He enjoys writing. I know he's written for some of our CFI Insider publications and also your own kind of platform. So I would recommend connecting with Bruce, follow what he's doing, and we'll make sure to link that in our show notes for the episode. But thanks for your time today. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. And I want to leave it with you guys are doing a fantastic job. You've done what is necessary in the interview world, which is adapt.
Yeah.
And you're really one of the leaders right now in that approach, which is follow the science. So good on you.
No, appreciate that. We're better together. So
Yeah.
appreciate the support. And thank you all for listening to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And to keep this conversation going, follow the Truth Be Told podcast on LinkedIn and Truth Be Told CFI on Twitter. On behalf of the International Association of Interviewers, Rick Lander-Zalowski, and our valued sponsors, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast.